Hello, my name's John Smeaton, and on behalf of Voice of the Family, I welcome you to the Family and Life Academy and to the sixth and final lesson in our course on natural law. The course is written and presented by Dr. Joseph Shaw, a philosopher and author. The first 5 lessons are available for you to watch again at whatever time suits you best on the Family and Life Academy website. In his last lesson, Dr. Shaw covered the moral theories which came to oppose natural law as it had been formulated by St. Thomas Aquinas, such as the moral theories of John Duns Scotus and William of Ockham in the Middle Ages, to some of the major figures of Enlightenment ethics, such as David Hume and Immanuel Kant. For his 6th lesson, Dr. Shaw's topic is natural law and practical ethics today. At the end of the lesson, Dr. Shaw will answer any questions you may have about natural law, which you can put in the chat window. And now I will hand over the stage to Dr. Shaw.
Yes, sorry, here I am. Thank you very much, Mrs. Smeaton. In this lecture, I'm going to talk a lot about gay penguins, a topic close to everyone's heart, I'm sure. So in this final lecture, I will attempt to resolve the problem which I described in the last one. How can natural law still be useful today after the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the Protestant Reformation, and so on? Natural law ethics is best known today for the importance it gives to teleology, the nature and purpose of the sexual act, of marriage, and of human nature in general. This is fair enough, but needs to be set in the wider context of the kind of moral objectivity the natural law tradition supports, that some things are worth doing or having, such as knowledge of the external world. In contrast to a common popular attitude, natural law implies a set of obligations which we inherit and cannot repudiate. One way in which natural law arguments are kept alive in the popular imagination is by attempts to debunk them. The endless attempts to prove that same-sex sexual activity is widespread in the animal kingdom, for example, are presumably motivated by the hope to disprove some simplistic natural versus unnatural distinction applied to sexual acts, a distinction associated with this tradition. This form of argument is exemplified by the way that the subject of supposedly same-sex attracted male penguins seemed to dominate the thoughts of the media in Britain and further afield for a spell in 2006. This illustrates the tendency of people enjoying cultural hegemony to fail to understand their opponents, since they seldom, if ever, have honest conversations with any of them. It should be obvious that gay penguins, to the extent that they exist, have as little to teach us about natural law as it applies to humans, as the female spiders who eat their mates. The natural law argument, which the gay penguin debate caricatures, and which I outlined in the previous presentations in this series, certainly does connect the right thing to do with nature, but to perceive what is in accordance with nature, or specifically human nature, is not simply a matter of statistical generalization from what actually happens in nature. It is a matter of what ought to happen by nature. There are humans with only one arm or 6 fingers on one hand, and there are humans who are born blind, but it is not very difficult to make the judgment that humans by nature have 2 arms and 2 legs, that they ought in some sense to have 5 digits on each hand, and that it is natural for humans to be able to see. Such judgments are related to an understanding of what it is for a human to be a healthy specimen, what it is for a human to flourish. Aristotle would propose such a judgment on the basis simply of careful observation of human nature in its various states, an observation which he would happily concede is value-laden, or would do if he made a fact-value distinction. Aquinas would connect it with God's plan for us. In the last lecture, I explained how the scientific revolution and developments in philosophy made this kind of argument harder to make in modern times. Biologists today will tell us that talk of health and flourishing may be a convenient shorthand, but that there is no nature with a capital N or providence with a capital P, which can be read off the data gathered from empirical observations. This cuts both ways. We would have to say that being able to see is typical, statistically speaking, for humans, and leave aside any normative statements. By the same token, the example of gay penguins can't underpin any normative conclusions either. Nothing we can observe on this view justifies conclusions about what we ought to do. However, the separation of observable facts and moral imperative is far from complete in modern discourse. On the contrary, moral philosophers are sometimes criticized for failing to take more notice of empirical psychology and sociology, themselves underpinned by biochemistry and neuroscience. Debates about public policy are driven by what have come to be known as good outcomes and bad outcomes. Bad outcomes are things like unintended pregnancies, reduced life expectancy, and criminal behavior. The good ones are most simply the absence of these, though more complex positive achievements are held to be worthy of celebration and are held up as examples for imitation, such as athletic achievements or upward social mobility. This is an aspect of the development which came up in the fourth lecture in this series. There I noted that while political theorists often insist that the state should be neutral about what conception of the good each individual should pursue, in practice some ideas about what counts as a well worth life are clearly privileged over others in today's liberal democracies. Debates about these methods are far from consistent, but however confused and incomplete they may be, policy is being determined by a sense that certain concrete life outcomes are thoroughly bad, while others are good. It may be objected that no objective basis for these judgments is actually accepted by the people making them, the political class and their friends in academic subjects such as sociology and political science, and the journalists who pass their views on to the wider public. If you ask any of these individuals whether there are objective moral truths which demand our assent in every age of history, regardless of what we or others actually desire, they will almost invariably say no. So what grounding do their own moral judgments have? They are not eager to articulate the basis for their opinions, but seem to rely implicitly on the consensus of enlightened opinion, that is to say, the consensus of the political class. This is tolerant of sex outside marriage, for example, but views girls dropping out of their A-levels as a result of pregnancy as a thoroughly bad thing. When the elite disagree among themselves, the arguments they are typically use are couched in terms of outcomes which they agree about. So, for example, the legal treatment of prostitution and hard drugs, issues which currently divide the political class, are discussed in terms of whether the satisfaction of private appetites, which they would say is obviously good, outweighs harms such as crimes, which are obviously bad. This raises the question of whether and how natural law arguments can have force today. While the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment successively challenged the natural law tradition, modern ethical and political thinking is itself based on extremely weak foundations. Philosophers and scientists of the last couple of centuries have told us that we cannot meaningfully talk about flourishing or ideal agents, but we talk about them anyway, just on the basis of a fragile and ever-shifting consensus. can we do something better? In terms of the history of ideas, what I have described about the way public policy debates work represents the triumph of the approach taken by David Hume. We all have our own desires. Society shapes these in order to maintain social peace. The net result is a set of moral principles maintained and modified by the political class with no philosophical justification. They are not correct, they are simply what we happen to believe. But that's not quite right, for what Hume and his followers are saying is that there is no such thing as being correct, except it being believed, perhaps embedded in moral language, perhaps picked out by an elite of competent judges. To combat this, from the 1970s onwards, one group of thinkers combined natural law with the thinking of Kant to provide them with an alternative basis for moral thinking. Aristotle told us that humans have a characteristic activity, in Greek an ergon, and that it is rational for us to engage in this. Indeed, acting in accordance with our characteristic activity is what it is for a human to flourish. The new natural lawyers, as they are known, reject the idea of an inward, natural disposition towards a certain way of life as the basis for a moral theory. One of the founders of the theory, Professor John Finnis, mocks the concept of the ergon. Instead, in a Kantian fashion, we are said to recognize by reason the objective value of certain goods: life, knowledge, justice, friendship, art, religion, and perhaps a few other things. These goods are things we should in our lives respect and promote, and in doing so, we may be said to live well. Aristotle's conception of a flourishing human combines two components: virtue and contentment. So the flourishing person is an admirable person, the kind of person we would like to be, and the kind of person for whom good action is second nature, to use an Aristotelian phrase. In addition, this is a person not easily disturbed out of a deep sense of happiness or contentment. Kant, by contrast, is not interested in either aspect of flourishing, and is not clear how they fit in to the new natural law theory. Without the notion of a characteristic activity which expresses one's nature, which is rejected by the new natural lawyers, the Aristotelian notion of flourishing is left without any basis in human nature. Kant's approach has the advantage of asserting the objectivity of morality. The rational agent perceives fundamental moral principles in the way that we perceive fundamental principles of logic and mathematics. The difficulty is that by separating morality from human nature, it becomes so abstract and desiccated that, as I noted in my discussion of Kant, it seems possible simply to walk away from it and live according to rational self-interest, prudence. One wants to ask, in response to Kantianism, what has this got to do with me? Kant, of course, insists that we are rationally obliged to be moral. But what kind of force does this have in reality? Why can't we simply pursue our own interests? The new natural lawyers can do better than Kant in this respect, because what they are asking us to cognize by reason is not an abstract principle, but a set of goods or values which we should recognize as having a role in life, and whose importance we should appreciate in a practical way. In this theory, however, these goods have a certain arbitrariness. They are not good because they fulfill human nature. It is rather the other way around. They are good for us just in the sense that they are good in themselves. At more or less the same time as the development of the new natural law, another group of moral philosophers was reviving interest in Aristotle and virtue ethics. The notion of flourishing, as I have just presented it, is at the heart of their thinking. It is by thinking about what makes for flourishing, what makes for both happiness and being an admirable person, that we can gain an understanding of what the individual virtues are as components of a flourishing life. And from our understanding of the virtues, we can determine how to live. These are the modern followers of Aristotle I noted in the second lecture of this series. And as I noted there, their interest in the language of virtue can lead them to moral relativism. They notice that morally freighted words like honour and rationality change in meaning over the centuries as different societies develop distinct understandings of what these things are and what they require. And these theorists lack the resources or the desire to explain why and in what way one understanding of these things is correct and the others are wrong. It follows that what it is to flourish will vary from age to age, which Aristotle would have found very strange. For Aristotle, morality is given stability and universality by the stability and universality of human nature. What the neo-Aristotelians have done in seeing different interpretations of human nature as equally valid, or simply by saying that we can't criticize one from the standpoint of another, confirms one aspect of the Humean conception of morality as potentially changing over time, as I described in the last lecture. I should emphasize that the new virtue theorists and the new natural lawyers have many helpful and important things to say, and their work has brought back into the philosophical debate, particularly in the Anglosphere, crucial concepts and theoretical possibilities which had long been banished. Nevertheless, they illustrate, once again, the way Humean and Kantian trends tear apart what was united in the natural law tradition. In this case, what has been lost is the idea of human nature as the basis for morality in the twofold function it had for Plato and Aristotle. First, it guarantees that we have some interest in the discussion because we are all human and we are all surely wanting to flourish, to be happy. Secondly, it guarantees that morality is objective because human nature is universal. It seems to me that this combination is something we need to hold on to if we are to maintain an authentic natural law tradition into the future. The hole which has been left by the disappearance from moral discourse of human nature is, in this twofold aspect, personal and universal, is very evident today when human nature is no longer being contradicted or disputed, but simply denied. What modernity or postmodernity now offers us is nothing less than the chance to create ourselves in any way we wish, with or without surgical validation. Our deepest natural instincts and capacities are held to be irrelevant to what we truly are or can be. In philosophy, it is recognized that we cannot appeal to anything more fundamental and uncontroversial than deep-seated ethical instincts. One of the more surprising revivals of recent decades has been the theory of ethical intuitionism, which makes much of this idea. But even those who are not formally intuitionists tend to accept that for an argument in ethics to be persuasive, it has to appeal to our instincts. There is a difficulty, however, in that ethical instincts clearly change over time. And with some knowledge of the history of ideas, we can see how, for example, Christianity changed some attitudes. And how the theory of utilitarianism seems more natural to people now than it did to people a century ago. One way of trying to overcome that problem is by appealing to a wider range of moral intuitions, those held by a wider range of people in terms of time and space. There are some moral instincts which are, for practical purposes, universal. Certainly, this seems a more helpful way of ascertaining the law written on our hearts by God than simply taking a sample of opinions from a seminar room full of graduate students. But a complementary approach would be to ask how these intuitions and the practices and institutions associated with them actually work to bring about or preserve what is recognized by those involved as good outcomes. This brings into focus the teleology of our virtues and practices, very much the territory of classical natural law. To illustrate what I mean, I will conclude this series of talks with 4 examples of friendship, contraception, same-sex marriage, and gender. It may seem that friendship is not an obvious subject for philosophical investigation, and for long stretches of the history of philosophy, it has indeed been ignored. Aristotle, however, discusses it at some length because it seemed to him to be a problem. In Aristotelian moral psychology, agents act to promote their own flourishing. Friends, however, commonly seem to promote each other's flourishing. Aristotle had stumbled over altruism. But what in his system, which is essentially based on enlightened self-interest, could explain this? Aristotle thus asks the question, what is friendship for? What function does it have? What good does it do? How does it help those who engage in it to get what they want or ought to want? The answer he gave is that there are different kinds of friendly associations corresponding to the different kinds of thing different kinds of people want out of life. First, there are business relationships, which in ancient Greek are covered by the same term as what we would call friendship proper, philia. These are relationships of mutual advantage in terms of money. The merchant has this kind of friendship with his suppliers and his customers. The relationship is bound together by its goal, its telos, material gain. If it stops working for a participant, it will be dissolved. Second, there are friendly social relationships which are aimed at pleasure, as with drinking companions. The telos is pleasure, and this can be achieved best by drinking with a group of chums, particularly those who are amusing. Third, there is what Aristotle regards as the highest form of friendship, that which has the goal of virtue. In this case, the friends assist each other in growing in virtue and encourage each other in doing virtuous deeds. Aristotle has quite a lot to say about how this works in detail, but the principle is clear enough. All kinds of friendship, since the Greek philia is so broad, we can perhaps say all kinds of amicable relationship, can be analysed in this fashion. The interaction of 2 individuals must be understood in terms of a third item, their shared goal. The nature of the goal sets the nature of the relationship. In the same way, the nature of the relationship implies the nature of the goal. If we want to know whether an amicable relationship is beneficial, we must ask, what do you do together, and what effect does this activity have on your life or your character? Aristotle is a broad-minded philosopher. He takes life as he sees it and he tries to understand it, and his discussion of friendship is an example of this. Analysis in terms of the telos of the relationship seems very plausible, and if we accept it, it can be a powerful tool for understanding what has gone wrong in a relationship when they do go wrong. Analyses of friendship which are not based on the idea of a shared pursuit of a goal often turn into discussions of mutual exploitation and power dynamics. These concepts have their uses, but they can miss the point. To understand why a married couple, for example, maintain a relationship through difficulties, talk of emotional dependency, the go-to explanatory concept of much moral psychology, is often inadequate. To understand the relationship, one must understand that each party is trying to achieve something external to the relationship, an objective good which is tied up with their own flourishing. In this way, relationships can be understood as a component part of an Aristotelian idea of a flourishing human nature. The next example is of an argument in the natural law tradition, which was developed by one of the founders of the new natural law, the late Professor Germain Grisez, in the 1970s. Up to then, although the teachings of the church were extremely clear, the connection between the prohibition on contraception, or artificial contraception, depending on how you define it, and one's flourishing as a human being was not so clear. Certainly, it seemed obvious that contraception was against nature in general, and of the nature of the marital act in particular, But in the face of the challenge to this teaching of the Church and the dissent against Pope Paul VI's 1968 encyclical on the subject Humanae Vitae, this needed to be articulated more clearly. One approach, which we find in the writings of Pope John Paul II and Dietrich von Hildebrand, is in terms of contraception vitiating the self-giving of the couple. This approach is rooted in the school of philosophy known as phenomenology, of which Hildebrand and John Paul II were both proponents. It raises the question, however, of why abstinence within marriage would be acceptable if contraception is not. Griset's approach is different. One of the arguments used by those dissenting against the teaching was, and still is, that the marital act strengthens the marital relationship, as well as having the goal of procreation. Since it has two good ends, unitive and procreative, it is surely acceptable, so goes the argument, to make use of it for one of the two ends and not the other on occasion. Griset's argument is that the unitive end is achieved through the procreative end. In the marital act, the couple becomes, as he puts it, a single reproductive principle. It is in this way that they are united. That is why the marital act has its unitive potential. To put it another way, the emotional bond characteristically created or deepened by the act is connected with the fact that it has procreative potential. That is why things are arranged by nature in this way. This procreative potential may not be realized for all sorts of reasons, up to and including the case in which one of the parties is infertile. It is quite another matter, Griset goes on, deliberately to close off the procreative potential of a particular act. The deliberate denial of the procreative potential directly undermines the unitive nature of the act. It is not just a matter of focusing on one aspect of the act's teleology at the expense of another, but to undercut them both. This argument has force only insofar as one is committed to respecting natural law, but like the argument just given about friendship, it demonstrates the power of a teleological analysis. The unitive potential of the marital act is not some mystery at which we can only marvel. It fits into a whole teleological system. The human race must be continued through procreation if we are not going to die out. This requires not only a biological process, but the maintenance of a home in which the children can be reared. It makes perfect sense, therefore, that the procreative act should also have the effect of strengthening the relationship of the biological parents, whose benevolent instincts towards their offspring will also in due time be engaged. This is not the arbitrary will of the Creator so much as the inner logic of human nature, which is inextricably bound up with our good, our happiness, as willed by God. The marital act cannot be taken out of this nest of goals and consequences without doing violence to its nature and meaning and to our flourishing. For my money, the best articulated argument against same-sex marriage set out when the issue arose a decade ago was that made by three of the next generation of new natural lawyers after Griset, namely Sheriff Girgis, Robert George and Ryan Anderson, who wrote an article and then a short book called What is Marriage? Man and Woman, a Defense. The article was published in 2010 and the book in 2012. As the title of that book suggests, Girgis et al. Start from the question of what marriage actually is. The way to understand a social institution such as marriage is to ask what it is for, what is its teleology. This should fit together with its internal arrangements, social attitudes to it, and its legal recognition and treatment. It should be obvious, though, apparently it is not, that radical changes to an institution such as marriage need to take this teleology into account. If the institution has an important function in society, then it might not be a very good idea to change it in such a way that it cannot perform that function as effectively as before. Thus, Gergis et al. Point out that marriage is an institution for the raising of children, and that is why it is the way it is. As they put it, and I quote, "Marriage is the union of a man and a woman who make a permanent and exclusive commitment to each other of the type that is naturally fulfilled by bearing and rearing children together, and renewed by acts that constitute the behavioral part of the process of reproduction." Unquote. It is only when one understands the teleology of marriage that its traditional features make sense. Consider 4 of them: the legal significance of consummation, the legal restriction on divorce, the legal rights of parents over their children, and its traditional limitation to opposite-sex couples. King Henry VIII of England, not finding his 4th wife, Anne of Cleves, attractive, never consummated the marriage, and after a decent interval he divorced her. This is not the same as saying that the marriage was null. It was perfectly legally valid. But in civil law, until recently, and canon law, a marriage which is not consummated is not binding. The couple can separate and remarry. Why should consummation be of such significance? Because the teleology of marriage is such that marital relations are not an accidental feature of it, but rather essential to it. It cannot be fulfilled in its teleology without them. An unconsummated marriage is, in a sense, incomplete. Why is divorce restricted? In different societies over the centuries, the ease of divorce has varied a great deal, but it is typically legally regulated and restricted, at least to some extent. The protection of the financial interests of both parties is certainly one reason for regulating it, to insist, for example, with many traditional societies, that a husband who divorces his wife let her take her dowry away with her. But there is a tendency not only to control the process and ensure that it is fair, but to make it difficult, and in many circumstances, in many societies, simply impossible. This is, of course, because the marital union is the basis of the home in which the children of the marriage are to be brought up, and this home needs to be as stable as possible. Parents, again, have legally recognized rights over their children. The right to determine how they are to be educated, for example. This respects the function of marriage as the ideal basis for an environment in which children can be protected and nurtured. To remove these rights, as has been happening gradually over recent decades, is to undermine the capacity of this institution to do its job. Finally, why has marriage not, until very recently, been possible in law for same-sex couples? As Gergis et al. Say, this is not very mysterious. Only a couple comprising a biological male and a biological female can, without technological assistance and probably the biological involvement of third parties, have children. There is, of course, nothing wrong with people of the same sex having a close personal relationship, but opening up marriage to such couples is more than simply an abuse of language. If it means anything, it means that the social and legal institution has to adapt itself to a kind of relationship with an entirely different teleology. Since the social and legal characteristics of traditional marriage exist to facilitate its traditional teleology, this facilitation will be undermined if they are changed to accommodate a completely different teleology. Thus, for example, the legal significance of consummation has been undermined, if not destroyed, by same-sex marriage, since there is no parallel reality in same-sex relationships with the same significance. Again, it would be unjust to demand of same-sex couples the high level of commitment implied by even moderately strict divorce laws, because there is not the same biological family unit to protect by preventing the couple from ending their marriage. Again, the legal significance of marriage in the tax and benefits system, in decision-making about medical care for the spouse when incapacitated, and the like, no longer make so much sense because a same-sex relationship does not have the same dynamic. The couple are not bound to each other, cannot take each other for granted in terms of material and emotional support as a traditional married couple. The ongoing debate about gender illustrates in an extreme fashion the rejection of an objective conception of human nature, which is at the heart of the natural law tradition. Feminists used to distinguish between biological sex and the social role and self-understanding of what it is to be one sex or the other, and call the latter gender. What gender theorists claim is that gender in this sense encompasses sex as well. There are biological facts about reproductive organs and secondary sexual characteristics, and some people have some of these attributes and other people have others, but these are not necessarily connected with the sex or gender of their possessors. Being a woman is not a matter of biology, but of gender. Having a womb doesn't make you a woman. What makes you a woman is thinking that you are a woman. What makes you a man is thinking you are a man. The statement that what makes you a woman is thinking you are a woman, though often repeated, just doesn't work as a formal account of the concept of woman. You can't define something in terms of itself. You can't include a word in its own definition, because that would be circular and uninformative. We must go beyond the slogans of the gender theorists to explain what is really going on here. One key idea is that of feeling like a woman. How could one know one felt like a woman if being a woman is just a feeling? What feeling exactly is that? The answers gender theorists fall back on are commonly based on stereotypes, usually rather crude and old-fashioned. Thus, in terms of internal feelings, girls, to illustrate, like playing with dolls, women like watching romantic comedies. In terms of external presentation, girls like wearing pink and women have long hair and wear lipstick. So a child who likes playing with dolls should be encouraged to wear pink, and an adult who likes romantic comedies should have long hair and wear lipstick, if they don't already, so that the interior sense of gender can correspond to the exterior gender presentation, to ease the discomfort of gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria simply being the condition where they do not coincide. This dysphoria can't be defined in terms of having the wrong gender for one's sex, since there is no separate objective concept of sex, but it can be defined in terms of gender feelings not corresponding to gender presentation. Gender theorists have an indefinitely long list of typical internal feelings and external presentations, and can say that feeling one is a woman or a man is a matter of having some, though not necessarily all, of these things, and similarly with presenting as a man or a woman. Among the things included in gender presentation are physical characteristics which can, to some extent, be changed with surgery and hormone treatment if desired. And there can be as many genders as you like to correspond with all the different ways you can feel. The result of all this is that sex and gender is subjective. It depends on a state of mind. It is not necessarily a matter of choice. We are often told by gender theorists that we can't choose what feelings to have. But in terms of self-discovery and subsequent self-presentation, we are all invited to create for ourselves what we want to be. Although many feminists are horrified to see the severing of the connection between biological reality and the experience of being a woman, gender theory takes to its logical conclusion the old feminist slogan, "Biology is not destiny." Biology is just one aspect of human nature for natural law, but it is certainly a fundamental one. It would be trite to say, as apparently Sigmund Freud said, that biology is destiny, but it certainly cannot simply be ignored if we are interested in the question of what it is to flourish as a human being. On the other hand, while the debate sparked by gender theory has focused attention on biology, there is no need to deny that there is such a thing as social roles and expectations some of them embedded in the law of the land. Natural law gives us a way to connect the biology and the social role, and an objective basis on which to evaluate the latter. The first question for natural law theory is what biological sex is for. It obviously has something to do with reproduction, and indeed the most rigorous definition of sex differences is in terms of the biology of reproduction. Namely, the females of any species produce relatively large gametes, and males produce relatively small ones. Some species are not sexually dimorphic, that is, divided into male and female individuals, but still have male and female parts, like a flower's stamen and stigma. Some living things reproduce asexually, but where there is sexual reproduction, there is sexual differentiation. An individual who produces larger gametes generally, though not always, makes a larger investment in reproduction at the earliest stages of the development of new life. This is certainly true in mammals. This greater investment, and connected with this greater vulnerability, is the basis of many social practices around human family life. These can take a range of forms, but they are only going to work in facilitating the continuation of a social group through time if they make provision for the needs of women by tying men in somehow to helping to meet those needs. Marriage, as a sole licit context for sex, as sexually exclusive and as indissoluble, is part of the ideal solution to this problem, as already indicated. It follows from this analysis that sex is not a matter of feelings. There may be psychological and even chromosomal complications which mean that certain individuals desire to live as if of a different sex, but such phenomena do not undermine the claim that differences between the sexes, even the ones which are clearly social conventions, are based in the differences between roles in sexual reproduction. On the contrary, the very idea of wanting to present oneself as a man or as a woman implied that there is such a thing in a reality beyond one's own feelings. There is a very common objection to a teleological analysis of institutions such as marriage or concepts such as sexual differentiation, which is that in many cases the teleology is not fulfilled. Not all marriages are blessed with children. Even more obviously, not all men and women have anything to do with reproduction. Childless marriages are still marriages. Childless men and women are still men and women. A marriage can be valid even if, for medical reasons, children are impossible for the couple. Why not then allow same-sex couples, for whom their own biological children are no more impossible, to marry? The objection, however, misses the point. It is no part of the claim of a teleological analysis of marriage or of anything else that the teleology is necessarily fulfilled. Not all acorns grow into oak trees, but that observation does not undermine in any way the reality that growing into an oak is what an acorn is for. The reason this teleology is important is that it enables us to understand the acorn's various features. Its store of protein, its embryonic shoot, and so on. An infertile couple who marry are taking on a relationship which has the teleology of child rearing. That is the kind of relationship they are entering into, presumably because they want the features it has. They may want those features even if they know they cannot have children. Again, those features will make their home better suited for the adoption of children, should they wish to do that. Why not, though, treat a same-sex couple like an infertile opposite-sex couple? Because even without gaining the ultimate goal of the relationship, an opposite-sex couple can have a traditional marriage relationship, and the same-sex couple cannot. This takes us to a level of complication to which I cannot do justice here, but one part of it is that opposite-sex the opposite sex couple can have what Gergis et al. Call the behavioral part of the process of reproduction. Another aspect is what the Catechism of the Catholic Church calls the, quote, genuine complementarity, unquote, a matter of the psychology of romantic heterosexual relationships. These things are tied to the teleology, whether, to repeat, that teleology is actually accomplished in its fullness. At this point, I must draw this series of presentations to an end. I hope I have suggested, if not demonstrated to everyone's satisfaction, that arguments inspired by the natural law tradition still have usefulness today, and indeed that they can solve a particularly acute problem in the standard ethical thinking of our political elites, that while they want to talk about flourishing using the terminology of good and bad outcomes, they have no objective basis upon which to base any idea of what flourishing exactly is. The reason that a natural law approach is not being more widely revived to solve this problem is that if we accept that human nature has moral implications, we must accept that we have needs and obligations which derive simply from being who we are, a man, a woman, a husband, a mother. We can take this further, looking at the teleology of social institutions, and talk about obligations which derive from even more accidents of birth, having parents in need of material support, having a country which is under attack from an unjust invader, having a particular religion, artistic tradition, or family honor. This kind of thing is intolerable to the atomistic individualism which has been the basis of elite thinking in the West for the past century. I want to end, therefore, with a brief response to the worry that a natural law analysis is an intolerable imposition on people who want to create themselves anew every morning, if not more often. First, this kind of self-creation, taken to the extremes to which it is taken in modern thinking, is a dangerous delusion. A delusion because it is impossible, as we see on social media and now also in the gender debate. The most liberated, self-created people turn out to be slaves of superficial ideologies, fashion, and stereotypes. They are the least free people it is possible to imagine. It is dangerous because this kind of self-creation is almost by definition pulling against the things which make for human flourishing. It leads to narcissism, depression, anxiety, and despair. Second, it does not follow that we should regard ourselves as slaves of traditional social roles or family traditions. All of these things stand between human nature in its most basic form and the fulfillment of human nature, and they either make that fulfillment easier or more difficult. Social conservatives tend to the view that they make it easier. Radicals and progressives claim the opposite. The fact is that some traditions are beneficial and some are not. A natural law analysis of them can try to uncover the truth in a way which tends not to happen in the usual modern debate. Living in society and not on our own in a trackless forest, scavenging for food, makes it easier to find our fulfillment, to be happy. This is because of many features of society, from the possibility of the division of labour to the facilitation of friendship and intellectual debate. It does not follow that every feature of society is good or should be accepted. Christianity reformed pagan society in a profound way, and we can see the fruits of the transformation which followed, withering today to be sure, but still visible. They are visible in the great art, the intellectual tradition, the tradition of the protection of the vulnerable, and all those things which Christianity imparted to those societies that embraced it. The natural law tradition, which itself developed in and through Christianity, is not a passive observer of the chains and misery of mankind, but potentially a liberator.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Shaw. Thank you. And well, we have a number of questions, and I'm going to begin with this one. Would David Hume have sympathized with the idea that what makes you a man or a woman is thinking who you are?
I think that if you'd put this to Hume, he would have thought that you were insane. And in the same way that practically anyone of his age would have thought that. And I think this is an example of how Enlightenment thinkers, and indeed many subsequent thinkers, radicals of various kinds, they tend to take for granted the world around them. And they say, well, all we need to do is change this. They point to some feature of the world, and people say, oh, but that would have terrible consequences. And they say, no, everything else would just stay the same. And they don't see that these things are all connected with each other, and the differences would just kind of roll out over the generations. I think that Hume is ultimately the grandfather of all these sorts of developments. And as I say, Hume would think that we were completely insane. Completely, he just thought, well, it's just obvious. It's just obvious that this is, these kind of things. Right? But it's not obvious if you accept Hume's own presuppositions, the presupposition which he bequeathed to the philosophical tradition. So he wouldn't personally accept it, but nevertheless, I think that it is coming out of Hume's ideas.
Thank you. Interesting. So, what do you think might be some of the conditions of an improvement in contemporary ethical and political thinking? Another questioner has asked.
Sorry.
I'll read it again. What do you think might be some of the conditions of an improvement in contemporary ethical and political thinking?
That's a good question. What would need to change? I think that, well, what I indicated towards the end was that what's stopping people accepting a kind of teleological kind of analysis, for example, is the attachment to a kind of atomistic individualism, because they've become convinced that anything that binds you into community, to tradition, to social roles, all those sorts of things, is tyrannical and prevents you being happy, because they can only imagine being happy through radical self-creation, rebellion, and so on. And that message is very, very powerfully repeated in popular culture and high culture, and you see it in the romantic operas of the 19th century. You see it in novels and films and cartoons and everything. So it's very difficult to get away from that idea, and I think that's very, very that's a huge problem. It's a huge obstacle to overcome. The idea that actually we can find our flourishing through accepting not any old limitation, but certain limitations, because actually those limitations make possible ways of life which are more interesting and more fulfilling than a way of life in which you're just a kind of, essentially on your own. And you can't have a proper relationship with anyone because that would involve commitments. And this is also a theme of popular culture, this tension, this problem, the whole popular cultural kind of idea of, men who can't accept commitments because they want to be free and all those sorts of things. So this is a kind of debate which is going on in our society and has for centuries, but it's the wrong side of the upper hand, as it were. But this is a very, very long-standing thing. And one is a big theme, of course, of Protestant polemic against the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, because of its traditions, it has this kind of it's chains. It chains us up. Whereas it's quite difficult to explain exactly why that's wrong. Actually, they are liberating. This burden is liberating, but that takes a lot of. You have to be patient to listen even to the explanation for that.
Thank you. Another question for you. How is gender ideology related to other woke ideas and to the older forms of radicalism based upon Marxism?
Well, I think further to what I just said about the idea of liberation, I think the teleology is a kind of is an iteration of this idea, that there's a whole set of conventions and ideas which are oppressive. So you have the oppressive class who somehow benefits. It's not often quite mysterious how they benefit, but somehow they benefit from oppressing this oppressed class. And Marx said it was the owners of property oppressing people who did not own property, the workers. And although, I mean, that idea, had its time historically, it's been recycled so that then it's the oppressive class is men and the oppressed class is women. So that's basically the idea of feminism. And now we have the idea that the oppressed class is the heterosexual cisgendered people, and the oppressed class are the other people, and so they're victims, and these institutions are being used to kind of hold them down somehow, and it fits into that pattern. And of course, in each case when this is done, this idea is going to get traction insofar as there's an element of truth in it. Now, obviously, there's an element of truth in Marx's analysis of, England 200 years ago, that the workers were pretty kind of badly treated often, and the owners of capital were having quite a nice time and perhaps not sharing sharing the profits with the rest of society in a way that they would have done if they'd been properly Christian, for example. But an element of truth, but the analysis itself wasn't really true. It wasn't because they were owners, for example. It's not the ownership structure that's exactly the problem. So again, here, yeah, there are people who don't fit in to gender stereotypes, for example. That's absolutely true. And if we it's an exaggeration to say the whole society has been set up to kind of enforce these gender stereotypes, which obviously it hasn't been. But yeah, there is a problem here, and there are people who feel uncomfortable, and they are genuinely victims. So great, you've got this victim group, and then you say, well, they're whole, and then you sort of extrapolate in this kind of Marxist parallel. So that's how I see it. That you find a victim group, and then you apply a Marxist analysis to it.
Thank you. There's just one more question. I think the theme of this question that we've had in rather touches on something you've said before, but not to worry. It can just repeat what you've said before. Can we base arguments on unchanging human nature without being accused of banishing spontaneity and of being cruel to those who conform to it?
Yes. So that is indeed the great question, which I've been talking about, and I think that obviously we've got to make clear when we address people, when we're talking to people who are not instinctively on our side, that this conception of human nature is not something which is narrow. Aristotle is often accused, with justification, I think, of producing an ideal human being, which is based on a very, very specific kind of person, namely an Athenian gentleman, male, of the 4th century BC, and he says, well, this is the ideal person. So someone living in Persia, for example, the Great Persian Empire, which is next door, great civilization, incidentally, beautiful art and writing and roads and all that sort of thing. None of them can be happy because they're not members of a participatory democracy and things like that, which for complicated reasons Aristotle thought was essential to flourishing. So it's a very, very narrow conception of the ideal. But Christianity brings in a much, much broader conception. You can flourish in all kinds of different ways. So one of the things we have to convey is that we are Christian Aristotelians, that we have an understanding of human nature which enables us to kind of see its beauty in a million different forms. And of course, that is actually one of the things which is being used against us, that this idea that the broad-minded person can see anything more or less as a kind of form of flourishing. Well, we're not that broad-minded. because we've got to be able, in order to help anyone, you've got to be able to distinguish between flourishing state and the state of being ill, for example, or injured, or unhappy, or whatever it might be. So you've got to have some ideals, but they're not oppressively narrow-minded. They take this enormously complicated and broad form.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Shaw, on that eloquent and uplifting note. We conclude the course. Thank you again, Dr. Shaw. Thank you for everyone for participating in this course. The video of this lesson will be made available on the Family and Life Academy website, along with study notes and other resources. And of course, you can rewatch any lessons at any time in the future. If you've appreciated this course, then do please let other people know about it, and look out for our other Academy courses, which are currently available or coming up shortly. And now it only remains for me once again to thank you so much, Dr. Shaw, for writing and presenting this course on natural law for the Family and Life Academy. Thank you.
Thank you.